Okay, hello again. Hi there. Hope everyone's doing well. This is part 3 of the lecture Introduction to Mixed Methods Research. Um, the focus here will be on specific mixed methods designs. This is actually, I think, oftentimes for most who hear this lecture, the most useful component for them because think we tend to think of mixed methods research. Well, I think often don't know what to think about mixed methods research, but just think of it as simply combining qualitative and qualitative data and or analysis. But just like there are a whole bunch of different qualitative research designs and a host of quantitative research designs, there are also a variety of mixed methods research designs. And if you're looking to use mixed methods in your own research, then it's important to understand and recognize these designs and then frame your study around these different designs, because doing so um, really helps communicate the value of the project and why a mixed method study is particularly useful for what you're trying to do. So, um, there are many types of different designs. I'm going to focus on 4 major ones here. Each of these can be broken out into sub-designs, and there's quite a lot of details. There's a pretty extensive mixed methods research methodology literature now that you can consult if you want to get into all these details. But I'm really going to focus on these 4 broad types of designs and then give specific examples of what the designs look like in published research studies. So starting with triangulation, before I say anything about this, I just want to make a note on notation. It's pretty common in the mixed methods design literature to use qual and quan as abbreviations, of course, for qualitative and quantitative, but also to either put them all in caps or to put them in lowercase to indicate whether or not that particular component is a major part or a supplementary, so the primary component or the supplementary component of the study. So as you'll see through the examples, not all mixed methods designs weigh the qualitative and the quantitative components equally. Sometimes the qualitative is the most central part, with quantitative playing a supplementary role. Sometimes it's the opposite, with quantitative being the most primary, with the qualitative playing a supplementary role. So that's what's indicated by qual and quan in uppercase or lowercase letters. Here you'll see in the case of triangulation design, we actually have qual and quan both in capital letters. And that's to indicate that in a triangulation design, one of the methods is not primary. In fact, both are considered primary. The idea of triangulation goes well beyond mixed methods research. Really, any time that you're trying to address some kind of research question using multiple methods, multiple approaches, multiple data sources, whatever it may be, and see if they converge onto the same conclusion. So in this case, in the mixed methods framework, is where the research question is pursued using a qualitative framework and then also using a quantitative framework, and then the emphasis is on to what degree is there convergence in the findings of these 2 methods. So really, they both play an equal role. One is not more important than the other. I've been giving the same example of a triangulation design because just one of my favorite ones, one of my favorite studies, it was done by a graduate student who was at the University of Minnesota several years ago, Omio Kim, who worked with Dr. Rich Lee, focused on parental cultural socialization in adoptive families. I'll just briefly say a little bit about what that is because I'll use some other socialization examples. But generally speaking, much of this research is in the US, but there has been research in other countries as well, focused on how parents teach their kids, particularly kids from ethnic minority backgrounds, about their cultural background. So how do parents talk to them about ethnicity, culture, racial issues, what it means to be a minority, what it means to be identified with a particular cultural background, talking about discrimination and all those kinds of things. That's all wrapped up in cultural socialization. So there's a robust literature on how parents, especially from ethnic minority backgrounds, do this with their children. So the question is, in adoptive families, and in particular transracial, transnational adoptive families, where you have largely white American parents, and in this case, Korean American children, how do parents who come from a different cultural background socialize their kids into their culture of origin? So how do white parents socialize their Korean American children about Korean culture? Moreover, how do they talk to them about what it means to be a minority in a racially stratified society? So those are pretty interesting psychological questions. And so they did a study in which they quantitatively assessed both the reports from the child and the parent of how much they engage in cultural socialization. So just looking at, this is a form of triangulation on its own, different reporters sort of looking at, does the child report of how much parents engage in this behavior match with the parent report of how much they engage with this behavior? Not surprisingly, there was not concordance here. The parents were reporting engaging in socialization behaviors at a much higher rate than the children. So the parents saying, yes, we're doing this, and the children are saying, not so much, right? So there's discordance, there's different perceptions about the frequency and intensity of these kinds of behaviors. And so this on its own is interesting, but it sort of leaves the question of, well, why this discrepancy? Why is it there? And so in this study, they also had a qualitative component that was an observational task. So they gave the families, the children and parents, some questions to talk about and observed those questions. And some of them were pertaining to race and how they talk about race and culture and their family. And so the researchers then analyzed those observations, coded them, and saw, what kinds of themes and concepts came out in those conversations. And through that, what they saw quite clearly is that the child report was the more accurate report. That the way the children reported on the quantitative measure about this, what their parents, the behaviors their parents get engaged in, was much more similar to what they saw actually in observation. So there was triangulation between the observation qualitative data and the child quantitative data. What was interesting about this even further is the observations also showed why it was that the parent data was higher. The parent data, which was really at the top of the scale, it became clear from the observations that they basically felt like if they did anything at all, like even the most minimal behavior, it was a lot. So doing anything was, from their perspective, a lot, whereas the kids saw that small amount of effort and saw it for what it was, which was a small amount of effort. Right? So this is a really nice study of triangulation, multiple forms of triangulation, because it shows not only which reporter is the more accurate reporter, but then why the other reporter is was off. Right? So this is a really nice example to me of a triangulation design where you use data sources from multiple perspectives, here quantitative and qualitative, to try to understand a particular phenomenon. Okay, and then we have the embedded design. And there's actually two different types of embedded designs. This one is really where you have a quantitative study, that's the primary area of focus. And then there's a qualitative component that is embedded. It plays a secondary role within a larger quantitative focus. So here you can see now the difference in notation with qual and lowercase. Here, really, this is the point of this study is the quantitative study, but the qualitative is inserted to provide something extra, to add something to the quantitative data. This is related to when, in the previous lecture, I was talking about different rationales or motivations to engage in mixed methods research. I mentioned the need to enhance the study. They sort of need to humanize it and hear people's voices. And this is exactly this kind of design where you're just trying to illustrate the quantitative data and the quantitative findings through the inclusion of some qualitative. This particular design, is by far the most common that I see in psychological research, and also has a lot of problems because it's very often this is the design that's used, but it's not highly articulated as to why this design is used, and then it becomes unclear what exactly the purpose of the qualitative component is. A common criticism of this design is that the qualitative component seems tacked on or just added on. That it doesn't add anything of value beyond just what's shown from the quantitative component. So in this kind of design, it's really important to show, to articulate that this is the role of the qualitative component, and then to be clear about what the added value of why it is useful to be able to include the qualitative, which is meant to just supplement the quantitative. However, embedded designs can also go the other way. So there's actually two types of embedded designs, the quan first, then qual, but then you can also have one where the qualitative is the primary study of focus, and then the quantitative plays more of a supplementary role. This you see far less often, much less often, especially because a lot of those who are doing qualitative research don't necessarily want to include this quantitative component, and it's unclear how exactly would a quantitative component be secondary or support a larger qualitative component. So I'll give examples of both of these so you can see what they look like, but we'll start with the quantitative first one. This is a study we did now several years ago where we were looking at the transition to university amongst a diverse sample. This is when I was doing my PhD at UC Santa Cruz, although it took us, this is actually an interesting study that we worked on. I remember my first day in my new research lab in 2004, working with Margarita Esmitia. We worked on this project. We did some analysis from day one in 2004, and it was published in 2013. So just a good example of how long these things can take sometimes. Hopefully not for any of you, it won't take that long, but sometimes it does. Um, so in this project, we were looking at how students transitioned across the first year of university with respect to their mental health measured by their self-esteem and depressive symptoms. And so we did some cluster analysis here based on the change to see in what way did people change over time in their mental health, and found these four groups. So this one group we called maintaining. So they were doing well and they stayed that way the whole time. Greatly improving, so those who started off low, but then over time were doing better. Good and declining, which is the opposite, those who started off good, but then got worse over time. And then finally, poor and declining, those who were not doing well from the beginning and got even worse. If you hark back to the previous lecture about naming clusters and qualitative analysis of quantitative data, what process did we go through to name these clusters as maintaining, greatly improving, and so on? Not a rigorous one, right? We did what most people do, and I wasn't really thinking about it at that time. But we did what most do, which is just kind of look at them and then say, yeah, I'll call it that. So keep that in mind as we move forward. But we tried to make these more sort of descriptive terms. So instead of calling them like super student and struggler, giving them those qualitative descriptors, we tried to be more descriptive about here's what's happening with the group. This is how they're changing. Okay, so this was the point of the study, was to examine these mental health trajectories and these subgroups of trajectories over the first year. However, we also had interviews with the sample, and so we had the interview data. First, actually, we also then, so the next thing we did, more quantitative research, is we looked at whether the degree to which those different subgroups varied in a number of dimensions, and one of them was identity. And so we see here that there's different trajectories where the maintaining and improving groups are both doing well in terms of their identity development over the first year, whereas both the good and declining and poor and declining groups are sort of decreasing over time in their identity. So we have these different mental health trajectories, we have it linked to identity, and so, but as I said, we had these interviews as well, which allowed us to get into there a little bit more into the clusters to understand, is there anything that differentiates these groups? Is there a way to understand something different about the maintaining group versus the improving group? But in general, just how do we characterize these groups? Can we say more about what the transition to college during the first year looks like for these groups? So that was the main focus, where we conducted a phenomenological analysis of each mental health cluster. So we basically, what we did is took each cluster, analyzed all of the interviews for the participants who are assigned to that cluster, and then wrote up a description of kind of what was going on with these students. What did it look like? So we came up with these cluster descriptions. So we weren't doing individual level analysis, but rather just trying to say, here's what's going on in the world for these people. These are the salient identity issues. These are the different domains in which identity issues manifest, and so on. And so it was purely meant to sort of provide details about what might actually be going on identity-wise in terms of these mental health transitions, whereas the main purpose of the analysis was to identify the mental health transitions and their links to identity were present quantitatively. Okay, so the embedded design where qualitative comes first and then quantitative is supplementary. As I said, this is a much less common model, and it might not be super intuitive immediately on how what this would look like. There's an example actually from the Gothenburg group that's a perfect example of this kind of qualitative first embedded design. Interestingly, this particular project, Johanna Carlson talked about and worked on when she took the mixed methods course at Gothenburg University that I taught in 2012. So this is actually a paper that sort of came out. I mean, she was working on it before and after, but it was discussed and developed a bit through that course. So in this project, they were examining identity development, as it says, in the late 20s, and they had both quantitative and qualitative analysis. The quantitative analysis focused on these different identity status categories of achievement, foreclosure, moratorium, and diffusion, and how participants moved from them from age 25 to age 29. Okay, so this is about classification of participants at two waves and patterns of change across those two waves. That's very interesting, and in many circles you could just publish this on its own, and that would be a nice helpful paper to see different identity status classifications and trajectories. However, that was not really the main point. The point of this analysis was just to provide sort of a broad sketch or a broad background, a backdrop I should say, for trying to understand more about what were the complexities of the identity dynamics, which was done through the qualitative analysis. So in the qualitative analysis, which was much more in depth than the vast majority of the actual published paper, they focused on these different domains of approach to changing life conditions, meaning making, and development of personal life direction, and how for some individuals there was a weakening of their identity narrative with respect to these dimensions, and for others there was a deepening of the identity narrative with respect to these different dimensions. And they used that at the individual level to create these individual maps to show how participants sort of fell on the spectrum of weakening and deepening with respect to these three dimensions that they identified. So this is a way of sort of visually representing the qualitative analysis to really try to get at what is the nature of identity development, especially in the context of so much stability that's being observed. So if you come back here, actually what's the most common sort of, well, not most, but what's very common across these different waves is a lot of stability, not a lot of change. So what does identity development look like in the context of a lot of stability? And so that's where they really got into these kinds of details. In this case, the quantitative analysis is really, again, just this backdrop that sort of says, okay, here's what's going on in general. But the qualitative is the primary empirical and theoretical contribution of this paper was all this qualitative analysis. And so you could see this in a variety of ways where you might use broad population statistics or some other general trend data to be able to say, okay, here's where the qualitative analysis sort of fits in a broader context. Here's how these data fit into a bigger distribution, or something like that is a good example of what an embedded design that leads with qualitative might look like. Hopefully we'll see more of these in the future because it's a really useful design. Okay, the third design is called the explanatory design. This is also what's referred to as a sequential design, because in this one, the quantitative study is done first, and then subsequently the qualitative study is done. Mixed methods designs and studies can be um, sequential, such as this, where one component is done before the other component, or they can be concurrent, where both are done at the same time. So like the triangulation design and both embedded designs that I showed were all examples of concurrent designs, where both data for both were collected and analyzed at the same time and then just mixed in different ways. In explanatory design, you really want to do the quantitative component first and then follow up with the qualitative. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, it's often the case with any study, but especially quantitative studies, when you do the analysis, you're left with questions as to why. Why do we see this particular pattern? And doing a follow-up qualitative study can help explain those particular patterns. So this is why it's called an explanatory design, is that the qualitative component is specifically there to help try to explain findings from the quantitative. Okay, and this is why it has to be sequential, because the qualitative is entirely dependent on the quantitative. Quantitative has to come first and dictates what happens with the qualitative design. Give an example of this. One of my former students, Mary Joy Swan, this was her dissertation study. was interested in the association between gender identity and ethnic identity amongst women of color in the US, and really trying to examine the patterns of them. And so she had these two measures, quantitative study done first, where she had a measure of gender identity, measure of ethnic identity, and then looked at the correlation amongst a bunch of other things as well, but then was really interested in trying to understand, why do we see that these are related? You know, we see a correlation here. I forgot to put it on here. Pretend there's a correlation. We see this correlation, but why do we see it, right? What does it look like? And so what she did then is design a qualitative analysis study project that followed after the quantitative, in which she purposefully sampled people from this distribution to be part of subsequent interviews. So what purposeful sampling, if you're not familiar with that term, means that you sample participants based on some particular criteria, right? So it's not a random sample, it's not a convenient sample, but it's a purposeful sample, that there's some sort of criteria that you use to determine who to sample. And the criteria could be whatever it is you want, whatever it makes sense in terms of your research question. It could be based on some demographics, it could be based on psychological characteristics, it could be based on whatever. In this case, what she was interested in doing was looking at individuals at different combinations of gender and ethnic identity. So those who are high, so each circle here represents those who are high on gender identity but low on ethnic, high on both, low on both, high on ethnic but low on gender, right? And then trying to understand how they manage these two identities through the interviews to be able to get at more why you might see an association or not an association in some cases. What was interesting, we decided to add also this sort of middle group, which is kind of an undifferentiated middle mass, to see what they look like and how they might differ from these other groups. Interestingly, she actually wasn't able to sample a group of participants who are high on ethnic identity and low on gender identity, because that section of the distribution was not represented in the data set. As I mentioned, these were all women, women of color. You would tend to see, probably, actually we have other data show if you have men of color, then this quadrant is represented, but this particular data set, it's not. And so they weren't included in the sample. So we have these 4 different groups that then are used for follow-up interviews. And there's a lot I could say about that, but one of the really interesting things is that these 2 groups really didn't differ in terms of their interview data, that the kinds of themes and concepts around multiple identities or regarding gender and ethnic identity really looked pretty much the same, whether they were high on both or they were sort of in the middle, which really helped reinforce the idea of us sampling from the middle, because it helped us understand better that it wasn't just a case of you need to be high on these things to show these particular identity structures, but you could be in the middle as well and you look very similar. So there's not as much, like, with respect to what we were examining, added value of sort of these higher levels of identification. So this was an example of an explanatory study, because there was this quantitative component at the beginning where we look at this correlation and we're trying to understand, why do we see it and not see it? And so the purposeful sampling of the interviews then was targeting trying to understand how these 2 identity domains are related to one another. More generally, with an explanatory design, just to abstract and how this could be useful, in almost any quantitative study, especially if you think back to the first lecture when talking about root metaphors, studies that are within the mechanistic framework, we'll have a predictor that's related to some outcome, or multiple predictors related to multiple outcomes. But again, we often just have these bivariate associations. And the question that we always have, or should have, after each one is why? Right? Why are these 2 related? Right? This is a mediator question. This is about the mechanism. Why do we see an association between this predictor and this outcome? Okay. Alternatively, we can have questions of when or for whom, which are moderator questions, right? Under what conditions do we see this association change, go away, get stronger, whatever? These explanatory mixed methods designs are particularly useful for identifying potential mediators and moderators. You do your quantitative study with your predictor outcome association, and then follow that up with the qualitative component can help you identify which mediators and moderators you might want to pursue in a further follow-up study. For example, if you do a randomized controlled trial of some new depression treatment and you find that it works overall, there's a significant improvement, but it's pretty small. Obviously, it works well for some people, but doesn't work for other people. You could follow that study up with a qualitative component to help identify what those particular potential candidate moderators might be. That would be a really useful design. Okay, finally, there's the exploratory design. This is the flip side of the explanatory design. So in exploratory, the qualitative component comes first and is primary, and then is followed up with a quantitative component that then helps reinforce the initial qualitative findings. This is actually a design that should be used quite a bit with a particular qualitative method, but often is not, and that method is grounded theory. Grounded theory is often used as sort of a general concept or a general term for qualitative, excuse me, a general term for qualitative methods, but it's actually a very highly specific form of qualitative research that's actually not often that used in psychology. There are many schools of grounded theory. I'm not going to get into all of that, but as Sharmaz talks about grounded theory, it has certain features. For example, grounded theory is focused on the discovery of process that structures the inquiry. So we're really looking at processes, which is from a mechanistic perspective, trying to understand relations among constructs, not necessarily the nature or phenomenological substance of it, but processes, interrelations. In grounded theory, data collection and analysis proceed together. And so you analyze the data as you're collecting it. Again, this is not very common in a lot of psychological research. Because of this, the analysis itself prompts discovery and development and new ideas. So there's actually not one standard protocol that you use from the beginning with participants through the end. It actually changes and morphs as new ideas come up because you're trying to refine your understanding of whatever the particular process is. Again, for this reason, you use theoretical sampling to refine categories. This is a form of purposeful sampling where you're targeting particular people based on some characteristics as the study goes on, because you're seeking to better refine and understand the concept. And so you might say maybe your initial sample is focused more on teenagers, and then you're wondering, will this process include emerging adults? And so you sample some emerging adults as well, and then maybe you find it doesn't fit them so well, and so you constrain the inquiry to adolescence, or you find that it does, and so you expand the inquiry, and then maybe you go from there to adulthood, and so on. It's sort of all about in the service of trying to discover this process and what the structure is of the process. And then finally, the idea of grounded theory is that the analysis itself leads to a greater level of abstraction. So it's not really meant to be close to the data, not meant to be describing the words and feelings and experiences of individuals, but trying to abstract again to this broader process model. I'm going to scare you here for a second by showing you this particular model. This was a model that was developed through a grounded theory analysis. You don't need to worry about any of the details. I'm just showing you what this kind of looks like. So it's all about, the arrows are important here. It's about finding flow and connection between and among different components. So this should look at least vaguely familiar to you broadly as a path analysis or structural equation modeling, that kind of thing, structural equation model. That's actually an excellent example of the exploratory mixed methods framework. Is you do a grounded theory first, develop your model like this. This is supposed to be the outcome of any grounded theories, is this kind of model, it's the theory. And then you can test it subsequently using quantitative methods via path analysis or SEM. That would be a really strong approach to conducting a exploratory mixed methods framework. Unfortunately, I rarely see that happening. Typically, the grounded theory process is done and you end up with this kind of elaborate process model, and then it's never actually tested further in any kind of quantitative or qualitative. Sort of the endpoint is just developing the model but not actually testing it. Another example of a different kind of exploratory analysis is coming back to, this is an example from one of my own projects. The idea of parental cultural socialization, as I mentioned, includes these components of both racial and ethnic socialization. And there's a general model out there that suggests that cultural socialization leads to ethnic racial identity, which in turn leads to higher adjustment. So it's a very simple model, but this is the general model. And so I was kind of interested in understanding the dynamics of this more. And so we collected some narrative data, and this is the prompt. Let you read over it. But the gist is that we were asking them, individuals, about a time they felt aware of their race or ethnicity when they were with one or more of their close friends. That's just to provide some context. So I told a brief story, a narrative of an event that they experienced. And then we asked them to take that one step further. This was based on Kate McLean's work on what we call a telling narrative. We said, okay, you told us a story. Now tell us a time in which you told the story to someone else. So it's a second narrative, the telling narrative, a story about telling this story. The idea behind that is trying to get at sort of the social embeddedness and contextual nature of storytelling, right? So these narratives, it's kind of a, you know, extra level of abstraction. It is sort of difficult for some participants to understand what we're asking, so don't feel bad if you don't understand it right away. But so they told us the story, and then we asked them to tell about the telling, and so we analyzed that. You know, what was the nature of the story? Who did they tell it to? And then for what reason did they tell it? Okay, and we found a couple interesting patterns. One is that these experience and prejudice stories, so stories about racism, discrimination, unfair treatment, they tend to be told to peers, friends, peers, classmates, whatever, largely for emotion regulation. So they were mad, they were upset, they were confused, whatever it might be. They went to their peers in order to manage that kind of stress from the experience. So that was one kind of pathway channel that we observed through this analysis. Another one that we observed is that stories about learning about culture. So learning about history, cultural practices, food, customs, whatever it might be, learning about culture. Those kind of stories tend to be told to parents. And they were told for the reason of just sharing life experiences, trying to connect with them in sort of a proxy for intimacy, perhaps. But that was another channel or pathway that we found. And so it was interesting to see these two different pathways, these different experiences, discrimination on one hand and sort of cultural experiences on the other hand, and how they went in these different directions. But more importantly, it really mapped on to the ideas of racial socialization and cultural socialization. And it made us think that peers might be a particularly important agent for racial socialization. So experience of prejudice, talking about discrimination, racism, prejudice, that falls within the racial socialization realm, that maybe peers are really the important agent of racial socialization, whereas parents are the important agent of ethnic socialization. So focused on issues of cultural heritage and things like that. So we started to think, okay, there could be these two different pathways. And there were some other studies that we did that also suggested this. So this was all based on qualitative, very exploratory kind of work, observations across multiple studies. We started to think we might be onto something. So then we set up multiple quantitative studies to be able to test it, where we essentially tested this model, where we had ratings of parent and peer, ethnic and racial socialization, and looked to see how it might be related to ethnic identity, exploration, and commitment, with the primary hypothesis being that parent, which is shown here, parent ethnic socialization should be related to identity development, whereas peer racial socialization should be related to, identity development. And so we tested this across 4 samples, and we consistently found strong evidence for that being the case. The white arrows are a little bit thicker because the pathways from parent ethnic socialization were stronger than for peers racial, but we did find that the quantitative survey-based data did bear out and replicated and generalized the findings that we got using the narrative methods. But we also observed something interesting where parent racial socialization was actually related to lower ethnic identity, exploration, and commitment in this case. So after we're accounting for peers and parents' other activities, what we're seeing is that parents engaging in racial socialization actually had a negative effect. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details about that. You can read the paper if you want to. It's not necessarily saying that parents shouldn't talk about race with their kids, but it does suggest that maybe some of the content of what they are talking about is different from what the peers are talking about. It could have a different effect. You can see here now we're left with the why question. Why are we left with this? And then you can see how this whole kind of mixed methods research can be cyclical, because now this was an exploratory mixed method study. We started with qualitative, we did a quantitative, and now we have this quantitative study and we have questions. We don't understand it. So now we can put this within an explanatory framework, follow it up with a qualitative study to try to understand why do we see these particular associations. So you can see here how you can really build a full program, a mixed methods program of research, in which you're not just thinking about uh, one study, but rather a series of studies, and how they all can build on each other using both quantitative and qualitative methods. So in sum, reviewed these four primary research designs: triangulation, two types of embedded, explanatory and exploratory. They all are quite unique and address different research questions. They're all mixed methods designs. As I said, this is not an exhaustive list of designs. There are more, and also each of these has variations. But just starting here and understanding these four different designs and using them to frame your research project will go a long way to enhancing not only the project itself, but also being able to communicate its value. And you know what time it is. See you soon.